In this guide, we'll take a look at all of your options for gearing up in any given raid tier, using Stormblood and Shadowbringers as references. As these two expansions not only had nearly identical progression, but also because Endwalker, and presumably any future expansion, will follow the same progression unless some major change happens. By taking this general approach, given Final Fantasy XIV's consistency, this guide should be applicable regardless of where you find yourself in the current expansion you happen to be in. But, for the record, this guide is made during the second half of the first raid tier of Endwalker, Asphodelos. Be aware that this guide, while not including any context to it at all, may contain major story spoilers for Stormblood, Shadowbringers and Endwalker. Now then, a raid tier is typically recognized by a specific raid, and in Final Fantasy XIV, specifically a set of 4 encounters in the overarching raid of the expansion, all released in the same patch. For example, Deltascape, Eden's Gate and Asphodelos make up each the first raid tier of their respective expansions. Sigmascape and Eden's Verse make up the second, and Alphascape and Eden's Promise make up the third and final raid tiers. For every raid tier, a specific item level can be considered the ground floor of the tier, the item level that is expected that you have as a bare minimum when you enter. I will refer to this bare minimum as simply X. For example, in Asphodelos, X is 570 or simply 570. And for Eden's Gate, X was 440, Eden's Verse 470 and Eden's Promise 500. This also coincides with the minimum item level requirement for the game to even let you enter the first Savage encounter of each raid tier, although you will absolutely find the encounter far easier with better gear. At the start of an expansion, the gear you are handed freely, as well as the accessories found in the immediately available max level dungeons, are all of item level X-10, and are merely good enough to give you a foothold in the endgame. To reach the item level floor of any raid tier, doing endgame content or doing any content really as a max level job will award you an endlessly farmable currency as well as a farmable currency with a weekly cap. Since these change names with each raid tier, I will refer to them as Farmable Tomestones and Weekly Tomestones. For the tier in which this guide is made, the Farmable Tomestones are named Aphorism and the Weekly Tomestones are named Astronomy. For the Farmable Tomestones, you can purchase gear that is precisely item level X. For the first raid tier of an expansion, this is gear expressly made for this purpose, but for the 2 raid tiers in the middle and the end of an expansion, this gear will be the augmented version of the Weekly Tomestone gear from the tier preceding it. This means, for instance, that Astronomy Tomestones will become farmable and the augmented Radiant gear will be easily collectible. The farmable Tomestone gear tends to be a fine starting point at the start of an expansion, but once a raid tier begins, you have far better options right at the outset. To be blunt, for the second and third tiers of an expansion, this farmable Tomestone gear will just happen to be whatever you already had when the new tier began. I will briefly mention that in the middle of a raid tier, a new dungeon is introduced that drops X+5 gear, but this is never worth farming. Moving on. For X+10 item level gear, at the start of an expansion, for what can be considered a pre-tier where no raid is available at all, the 2 non-max level trials you met throughout the expansion will have their extreme versions. One will drop accessories, while the other drops weapons, and both will be endlessly repeatable. More options open once the raid becomes available, which happens some weeks after an expansion release, or on day 1 of a patch that introduces a new raid tier in the middle of an expansion. For reference, here are the trials for Stormblood, Shadowbringers and Endwalker, and which dropped what. The main difference is that in Endwalker, it was the second trial that dropped weapons instead. Now, the raid opening is always combined with the release of a new set of crafted combat gear for every role and job, which will be X+10. The normal version of the raid will drop tokens which can be exchanged for X+10 gear as well. Be aware that for a significant portion of the raid tier, you're only allowed 1 token per fight per week, and that different gear slots take different numbers of tokens. Namely, chest and pants take 4, boots, gloves and helmets take 2, and accessories take 1. For the 2 raid tiers in the middle of an expansion, on the same day of the release of the new raid tier, a new trial as well as its extreme is also released. This extreme trial drops X plus 15 weapons. For example, this applies for Ruby Weapon and Emerald Weapon of Shadowbringers and Byakko and Suzaku of Stormblood. Then, for X plus 20, multiple options appear throughout a raid tier. First, the Weekly Tomestone gear is X plus 20, however, the weapons require a currency that you get for completing the final encounter in the current raid tier on normal 7 or 4 times depending on when in the raid tier. This currency sometimes also drops outright from one of the early bosses in the raid on Savage. For example, Asphodelos, the second circle, can drop the Discal Tomestone needed for the Radiant weapons available in Endwalker's first raid tier. Now, while a major patch tends to be around 3 to 4 months long, a raid tier tends to last around 2 major patches, meaning 6 to 8 months. On the major patch following the one that added the new raid, a handful of helpful additions get added for gear catch-up options. First, the crafted gear can be upgraded to X plus 20 by handing in the crafted gear itself for tokens, alongside purchasing Rain for the Farmable Tomestones to purchase augmented versions of the gear. The main difference here is that the augmented version of the gear cannot be overmelted in regards to materia, but in most cases, the extra item levels are more valuable. This means that with just money and farming tomestones, you can get a full set of X plus 20 item level gear. In Stormblood, Jay Tandar would do this in Ralgor's Reach. In Shadowbringers, Hillison did it in Yulmore, and for Endwalker, Rashti can help you in Razadhan. At the same time that this crafted gear augmentation is added, the corresponding tier of the expansion's Alliance raid is added, which drops an armor set of item level X plus 20. However, you can only win 1 piece per week. Completing this raid also grants you a token once per week that can be used to upgrade the Weekly Tomestone gear with only 1 limitation, which I will get to a bit later. Also at this same time in a raid tier, a new extreme trial is added. For the first raid tier of an expansion, this tends to be the final trial of the story. This extreme trial will drop X plus 25 weapons. For reference, that means Shinryu in Stormblood, Hades in Shadowbringers, and indeed the Endsinger in Endwalker. For the later raid tiers, it is a bit harder to predict, but for Stormblood we had Tsukuyomi and Seiryu, and for Shadowbringers we had Warrior of Light and Diamond Weapon. And now we get to the maximum item levels of a raid tier. The current raid tier's Savage version drops X plus 30 gear, and you will only be allowed to roll at all on the gear on your first clear of each fight per week. Not doing them in order and skipping to later parts will also lock you out of loot from the early fights if you don't do them first. Late in a raid tier, one or both of these restrictions may be lifted. These fights will also drop materials necessary to upgrade the X plus 20 Weekly Tomestone gear to X plus 30 versions of the exact same gear. Primarily the second and third fights drop these, with the third fight of a raid tier dropping the material necessary to upgrade the Weekly Tomestone weapon. For armor and accessories, once the appropriate Alliance raid tier opens, you can use the weekly token from there to purchase an armor or accessory upgrade material of your choice. Alternatively, you can also purchase these upgrade materials for an exorbitant amount of sacks of nuts, the quintessential clan hunting currency. Sometimes, very late in a raid tier, the weapon upgrade material may also be offered from these alternative options. To finish, the Savage version of the 4th and final boss of a raid tier will drop X plus 35 item level weapons. For most jobs, these are the best weapons, but occasionally these weapons may have worse stat distributions than the augmented Weekly Tomestone weapons to such a degree that those weapons take preference. So, if you want to start raiding Savage content, the common expectation of your average item level increases throughout a raid tier. Right on release day and a few days ahead, where crafted gear, while available, is scarce and likely costs a fortune, you should be fine with an item level of X. Meaning that you're fine if you kept up with the previous raid tier. Being smart about which tokens to roll on in the normal raid can also net you a few X plus 10 pieces to help you. Once crafted gear becomes more easily accessible, the expectation rises to X plus 10. And if the current tier's alliance raid is available, meaning around the halfway mark of the raid tier, you should expect to have augmented crafted gear, X plus 20, alongside some augmented weekly currency gear, X plus 30, as this half of the raid tier progresses. However, you can always meet teams with higher or lower expectations, as we're all people after all. The important part is to meet a raid team that agrees with your expectations and, more importantly, are fun to play with. Now, a side path of catch-up progression I have yet to mention are the Relic Weapons. At least since Stormblood, each expansion has introduced Relic Weapons alongside the release of the second raid tier. These weapons tend to have unreasonably long questlines and also get piecemealed out in about 4 major parts throughout the rest of the expansion. 2 for the middle raid tier and 2 for the final raid tier. When newly released, the item level limit on these relic weapons will be X plus 15 of the middle raid tier, and once the alliance raid for the raid tier releases, the quest to upgrade it further to X plus 30 will be available. When the final raid tier of an expansion releases, the relic weapon will be able to further upgrade to the new X plus 15 item level of that tier. And once the final part of the Alliance raid releases, the Relic Weapon will complete, reaching X plus 35 and typically having more stats to work with than the final Savage raid boss weapons. Not to mention almost completely freely customizable stats. However, due to how late in a raid tier Relic Weapons tend to become competitive, they are considered exclusively catch-up or helpful for ultimates. I hope this very generalizing item level notation was not too confusing to follow. That is all for this guide. I hope it inspired you either to gear your own character a bit or maybe even outright gear for Savage raiding. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing to get notified when I post a new video. Also, if you have any questions or anything to add, please leave a comment down below. Fun fact, in Stormblood, the final version of the relic weapons from Eureka had random properties, which could, in fact, be entirely invested in a single property, like critical hit, allowing you to have far more of this one property than any other. To no one's surprise, this led to most jobs wanting to optimize, grinding the currency necessary to reroll these relic weapons until they rolled, you guessed it, full critical hit.